Nature of Society Part 1, Session 5R. Last week we looked at the man-made world where all land is appropriated and those persons looking for employment or looking to set up business will have to seek these on those sites that are in production or purchase, lease or rent them from the landlords of those sites that are free for these purposes. We said that the wages of those persons seeking employment would be set by what is obtainable at the most marginal site. The entrepreneur will only pay a wage that is obtainable at the marginal site. This was depicted as follows. So we have the land that is all appropriated and all the sites of value are filled up. Where wages are set, the marginal product is set and the net profit and the net product is set. What is obtainable at the marginal site, the product, is to be divided between profit and wages. Profit would have a number of claims made of it, and these were listed as taxes, interest, dividends, and profit retained in the enterprise. If the claims of any of these are so large as to render a meager wage, a wage that the worker is unwilling to accept, then the enterprise will go out of production. More will be said on this later. We also made certain assumptions which are worth repeating again. 1. Each block column in our profile represents the production profile of the equal skill and effort provided by one man. That for each site, equal skill and effort is expended, which produces the varying levels of production, from the best sites to the worst sites. 2. The production profile is for all types of human activity: commercial, industrial, agricultural, residential, and recreational. The production profile is depictive of the type of human activity being carried out. Commercial activity yields higher values than do industrial or agricultural. Residential and recreational yield the lowest values. In session 2R, we introduced the triad, which said that the man-made world was essentially created by man's work on land, and the type of man-made world created depended upon the conditions at the point of interaction between man's work on land, and of course our diagram. Man-made world, work on land, man-made world determined by the conditions at the point of interaction. As we said earlier, if at the marginal site where common wages are determined, there are conditions that are conducing to minimizing this wage, not only will it affect the type of man-made world created, it will act as a disincentive to production and may render the enterprise unviable. Increases in taxation of all kinds, corporate, VAT, PAYE, will act as a disincentive. Increases in interest rates and payments will render doing business more expensive, will drive up prices and also drive up the cost of living for the wage earner, increasing wage demands which the enterprise is unable to afford. Conditions which are favorable for business at the margin will cause business to thrive and will lead to an expansion in the economy. Conditions which are favorable will lead to business failure and a contraction in the economy. The question as to where taxes should be best placed is an important question. The state needs to collect taxes in amounts that can meet its public obligations, and it must collect same in a way that is not deleterious to the economy. Ideally, it should impose taxes in a manner that gives an incentive to produce. That does not provide a disincentive to labor and is enough to meet public obligations. Before we proceed to suggest how and where taxes should be imposed, we want to examine the canons of good taxation as laid down by Adam Smith, a well-renowned 18th century economist. regarded as the father of Western economics. Adam Smith's canons of good taxation are as follows. 1. Taxation should bear as lightly as possible on production. 2. Taxation should bear equally on all. 3. Taxation should be easy to assess and collect. 4. Taxation should be paid by the person on whom it is levied and should be certain in amount. We will have a break now and we will discuss in detail these canons of good taxation after the break. The first canon of good taxation according to Adam Smith is 1. Taxation should bear as lightly as possible on production. Obviously, taxation which penalizes production must reduce production and thus reduce the yield of the taxes. As we illustrated earlier, taxes which are imposed on wages can have a deleterious effect on the marginal site and contract the economy. This is not the best place to impose taxes. 2. Taxes should bear equally on all. This is an elementary principle of justice. There is an ongoing debate in many countries that taxes are not borne equally by income earners. Additionally, small business, which are usually located at the margin, should not be taxed at the same rate as the bigger business, which are at the center of the economy. 3. Taxes should be easy to assess and collect. Taxes in most Western economies are very often difficult to assess and collect, and often involve the state in considerable expense, and this reduces the net yield of taxes. Because of this difficulty in assessments and the reliance on the honesty of the taxpayer in collection, there is much opportunity and prevalence of evasion, and as a result, much of the eventual collection is much lower than what it might be. An easier way must be found to assess and collect taxes if the state is to meet its public service obligations. 4. Taxation should be paid by the person on whom it is levied. When the entrepreneur who actually remits taxes to the state is able to pass these taxes on to others by way of increased prices, the result is that the ultimate payer pays considerably more than the actual tax imposed in the first place. What is more astounding is that it is more difficult to determine who is in fact paying the tax, and it is very likely that the taxation will be paid by those least able to pay it. 5. Taxation should be certain in amount. A tax regime should have as one of its main goals its ability to determine fairly accurately how much tax will be collected in advance of receipt of revenue. Of greater importance, and ideally in a successful tax regime, the taxpayer should know in advance what is his liability for any period. These two ideals would go a long way in creating a much more harmonious situation in the economy. Next week, we will look at the system prescribed by Adam Smith and recommended by other great economic scientists that will embody these canons. During the week, have a look at the impact of the current tax regime in force today in your own country. Make your observations and come back next week with them and let's discuss. In closing, let us hear again an excerpt from Emil Wolf and John D. Allen towards a new economic technology with respect to taxation. Taxation on employment does not only inhibit good industrial performance and high productivity, it actually acts as a brake on employment, inflating the cost of labor. Due to heavy employment on costs such as income tax and national insurance, many less profitable locations have become uneconomic to work, leading to a contraction of employment. This contraction of employment is seen working strongly in the service industries, where the tendency is to eliminate employment as far as possible. This trend has led to rapid growth of self-service in restaurants, hotels, filling stations, and supermarkets. At a time of recession, this underlying restriction on unemployment shows itself as a steep rise in unemployment, creating an onerous charge on the exchequer. When these charges are met by borrowing at high rates of interest due to the shortfall of tax revenue, the stage is set for economic collapse because of the industry's inability to carry the simultaneous burden of high taxation and high interest rates. The system of taxation must lie at the heart of the matter. By now, the syndrome is familiar. High levels of taxation, levied with little regard to taxable capacity, are forcing more and more productive efforts onto the margin, where they are under constant threat of being pushed over the precipice of bankruptcy. This leads in turn to greater centralization of industrial units in search of enough strength for survival. Inevitably, the weaker units depend increasingly on the state for grants, loans, subsidies, and other so-called incentives. In extreme cases, a total takeover or effective backdoor nationalization is the only remedy. In this strange cycle, mounting costs of state intervention and handouts are funded out of ever-rising taxes, whose impact necessitates still more intervention. What is needed, and needed urgently, is the establishment of an objective relationship between the government's requirements, taxation, and the capacity of productive units to meet these requirements. Next week, we will consider this issue further. Before we end, I would like to again let you attendees know that unsustainable development is an educational offering devoted to the dissemination of its cause to all of mankind, to those who have the English language as their official language in the first instance, and to all eventually all over the world. To make this possible, and because we do not charge a fee for this dissemination, we rely wholeheartedly on monetary donations to meet the cost of achieving these goals. If you have found these sessions useful thus far and would like others to have access to them, we would gratefully accept your donations should you be inclined to offer them. You can send donations to our PayPal account at the email address nigelgittins@gmail.com. Thank you for your kind gesture.